Welcome back to these series of lectures. This is 1122, the second half of Western Civ. Last time we talked about the Cold War, and we went through a timeline to give you some sense of the pace of these events and their very surprising end with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I want to spend a few minutes here looking in a little more detail of the causes of this collapse. Some long-term causes and then a few short-term causes. And we'll see if we can wrap up this discussion of the Cold War with some conclusions. First, long-term causes. The failure of centralized planning. Now, it's no accident that scholars refer to economics as the dismal science because economics is very difficult. It's a combination of numbers on the one hand, which you would think are predictable, and human behavior on the other hand, which is not predictable, at least not always. So you have this failure of this command economy run by bureaucrats out of the Kremlin, and this is going to have just a decisive impact on Russia. These central planners could not respond fast enough to shifts in supply and demand, where not just a few, but thousands of producers and commodities are involved. Again, in the West, we think of the market as taking care of supply and demand. In fact, supply and demand is synonymous with the market, but not in the old Soviet Union. Only old-fashioned self-regulating markets can do that. And only by that means were they the antithesis of centralization and planning. Again, how do bureaucrats calculate the number of tons of steel to be produced? In the West, that decision is made by many people that are financing construction projects, construction engineers, on and on and on. The demand for these products causes their supply to be increased. In a centrally planned economy, committees are making these decisions. The situation became even worse in the 1980s when the computer revolution took hold. That technology thrives on individual initiative and on an unconstrained flow of information, neither of which the hierarchical Soviet system was equipped to encourage. Let me take this a step further, this failure of the command economy. Stalin, for instance, could simply order workers to run a tractor or a steam shovel or a blast furnace. Now, these workers might not do it efficiently, but they would do it, and the job would eventually get done, no matter how inefficient it might be. But Mikhail Gorbachev cannot order anybody to write an imaginative computer program or to invent a more efficient silicon chip. People have to want to do these things or they will not get done. The means of production today are based on as much of what we think of as the working class does with its brains as what it does with its muscles. And no one has yet discovered how to command thought. Coercion ensures obsolescence, not innovation. So the Soviet system, systemically at its core, is ill-equipped to deal with a fast-moving market economy where supply and demand changes regularly. Another long-term cause of the collapse of the Soviets would be the alternatives to authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments. Increasingly around the Soviet Union, you see emerging more liberal type regimes, and this, of course, is going to weaken Soviet power. There's a decline also in state brutality. Borders are becoming increasingly permeable. People can move more freely, more easily from one country to another. It has a sort of a domino effect where word of mouth about liberalism and about representative style governments, open market economies, kind of almost in a sense of gossip where people talk about alternatives to these totalitarian systems. And I guess you could think of another long-term cause as a sort of continuing anti-imperialist sentiment. Consider the rapidity with which the great European colonial empires simply disappeared after World War II. This happened not so much because the victims of imperialism gained new military or economic power, but it happened because of the moral strength that accrued to them as world opinion shifted against the whole idea of empire. And of course, if you look at the Soviet Union on a map in 1980, you can see that indeed it is an immense empire, stretching from the Baltic in the west all the way to the Pacific in the east. Short-term causes, we've touched on some of these in our last lecture. We talked about perestroika and glasnost, these ideas of Mikhail Gorbachev to modernize the Soviet Union, to create a sense of pluralism in the country where there's more than one voice, not just the Communist Party, but perhaps a system of many parties, pluralism. This, of course, is unheard of in Soviet history. You could almost think of as perestroika and glasnost as Mikhail Gorbachev sort of letting the genie out of the bottle or opening Pandora's box. You can pick your mythology here. These ideas were designed to strengthen the Soviet Union, to make it a lasting and permanent structure, and yet they will end up destroying it or setting in motion those forces that Gorbachev can no longer control. The Soviet population itself, this is, I guess it's best to tie this to the failed invasion of Afghanistan, which began in 79 or 80 and will continue through the 80s. Gorbachev will begin to bring Soviet troops home. As the Red Army demobilizes these troops, housing and jobs for them are scarce. And this retreat from Afghanistan apparently causes the Russian people to begin to have doubts about their system, about the strength of this system. It's very difficult for them to understand this defeat in Afghanistan. And I should say it's also difficult for the Russians perhaps to understand Mikhail Gorbachev's willingness to sort of relinquish those states of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, East Germany. Gorbachev begins to now look away from the Warsaw Pact countries and concentrating on Russia itself. And this is an extraordinary development. The Red Army is pulled out of Eastern Europe as it's pulled out of Afghanistan. And I think this is a shock to the Russian people. Having been victorious in World War II, having established this immense empire, having been dominant for so long, for it to suddenly disappear without a shot being fired is difficult to take. Now, until probably the end of 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev had retained some control over these forces he had set in motion. But by 1990, the situation in the Soviet Union had deteriorated. Gorbachev sought financial and moral support, ironically enough, from the West to help prop him up. He appealed to President Bush, that's the first Bush, for both financial and moral support. Short-term causes, the Communist Party begins to disintegrate. Gorbachev switches from party chief to the presidency of the Soviet Union. In 1999, when the parliament banned the Communist Party and then threw its support to Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev was left with no followers. He's the president of nothing. The Soviet Union has disintegrated. Russia's still there, but the Russian president is Boris Yeltsin. Mikhail Gorbachev is president of the Soviet Union. Talk about the emperor having no clothes. So, Soviet military power begins to wane away, and again, Gorbachev willingly does this in an attempt to try to rebuild the domestic society inside of Russia, allowing the Warsaw Pact nations to assume their own sovereignty. This is, again, a remarkable series of events that I don't think anyone could have ever predicted. Now, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States during the 80s, is often given credit for hastening this process. I don't know we know for sure, even today, if this is true or not. Certainly Reagan's rearmament in the 1980s, combined with this notion of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, as it was called, these two things forced Gorbachev to make radical proposals for disarmament. Gorbachev knew that his country could not keep up with the vast expenditure that would be required to match the United States' efforts under Reagan. So instead of trying to match those efforts, Gorbachev approached Reagan and then, of course, Bush with proposals for dramatic cuts in strategic weapons and demobilization of the Red Army in Europe. So I guess we give Reagan some credit for this. I'm not sure. We may still be too close to these events to put them in the proper perspective. In my notes, the two strategic decisions which contributed most to ending the Cold War were NATO's deployment of American intermediate-range missiles in Europe and the American commitment to SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. Again, this confronts Gorbachev with an immense challenge. Either match it or make proposals for dramatic cuts for both sides, which will, in effect, end the military standoff between the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact on the one hand, and the United States and NATO on the other hand. So let's stop there, and I'll come back one last time with the Cold War, and we'll draw some conclusions. Thank you.